Welcome to the EarthWorks podcast, where our team will share the jargon of carbon from many of our turf friends from the past 30 years.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joel Simmons, and this is our 101 EarthWorks podcast. We're very excited. This is the Dalmatian version of the EarthWorks podcast, and I am very excited to be all learned up today. We have some great guests: Sheree Scarbrough, who is the founder of Silico Turf Inc., and Dr. Wendy Zellner. Excuse me, Wendy. Dr. Wendy Zellner, who is running Zellner's Research Solution as an adjunct professor at the University of Toledo. Thanks, guys, for coming. I appreciate it. I'm a little nervous because now we're in a place, we're going to talk about silica, and we're in a place where I may not be overly experienced, but you're going to teach us all up, and that's why you're here. And we're, like I said, very excited. I think this is going to be a great conversation because this is a subject matter that not everybody knows a whole lot about. So I'm going to let you guys do most of the talking, which is very hard for me, as you guys know. But Sheree, let me introduce you first and foremost. As the founder of Silico Turf, you've been in the business for a while. You've been working for some great companies, I understand, as a matter of fact, in your background.
Okay, just so everyone knows, I actually worked with Joel, learned everything that I know about soil from Dr. Simmons. So
you don't have to suck up. That's all right.
well,
But thank you.
True. And
I'll pay
I'm
you
very grateful for that.
Sheree we had the pleasure of having Sheree on our team for a number of years back in the 2000s, before you went out and started your own company, which was kind of neat. But you've been in the business for a while. You know, one thing I do want to ask you, and it's off subject, but I want you to share your experience of the Women's Open with us real quick, because we did a podcast on that with Troy Flanagan and a couple of the ladies that were there. But it was such a great experience, and you got a chance to get there and tell us about that experience of being at that particular event.
It was, and I just have such an admiration for these women that really want to be doing what they're doing and feel like they can be accepted and accomplished at that. So I was really impressed. I feel really lucky because I've been in the industry. I know how to mow greens. I did not want to mow greens at the Olympic Club for the Open, but I was really happy to get to be involved in that as an industry person. So getting to watch that and observe that and be a part of that, there was just so much energy and camaraderie, and I feel really, really lucky.
It must have been a great experience.
It was wonderful. And Troy was wonderful to have put that together, and Kimberly from Syngenta really made it. They did an amazing job. It was an awesome experience. I'm so grateful to have gotten to participate.
I've said this many times. I think that was one of the greatest things that's happened in my career is watching that whole camaraderie. And it was kind of cool that you were able to get there and be a part of that also. Tell us a little bit about Silica Turf. Tell me what it is, what you're doing, and then I'm going to let you introduce Wendy and tell us how you met Wendy, because the whole story has been pretty cool, and I'm very excited because I was able to share with Wendy the first time she had escargot, so I feel very blessed to be part of that. So it's kind of
in New
cool.
England, no less.
In New England, no less, exactly. Silica Turf.
So I had a stint with a company that had a product which was my introduction to the benefits of silicon, and what I experienced there, I just was really excited about the benefits, about the really necessity of having silicon in a program to get the full benefit and resilience that you can achieve on your turf grass. So unfortunately, that company that I originally started my venture with silicon was a venture capital company, and they were purchased by a big steel publicly traded corporation that really didn't understand or want to understand our industry. And then 2008 happened, and everything sort of fell out of the bottom of golf and that world. So we parted ways, but I just loved what I knew and had learned about silicon. So I reached out to a company down in Florida that had had their history many years ago trying to be in the golf market, and he didn't want to revisit that. So we worked out a partnership where he manufactures the product for me, and I get to still work with silicon, which I absolutely love. So that was in 2010. I launched Silico Turf LLC, and just have been, trying to have the banner out for the benefits of silicon. But there were a lot of challenges with that because it's not taught at university. There's
Right.
not, it's not recognized in the United States as a nutrient. It's just been a really uphill battle. I've been lucky enough to work with some really excellent distributors who embrace that science and have really done a great job. But a mutual friend of ours, Bill McKibben, who you know well, Joel. Joel and I have known Bill.
His book's right there. Right there.
Joel and I have known Bill for many years, and he called me out of the blue last fall and said, I just talked with these folks, and you have to meet Wendy Zellner. You have to reach out to this Wendy Zellner. She's your silicon sister. She talks about silicon and she knows all about silicon. And so we went to the Acres conference together and talked about silicon, and just what she's learned and uncovered in research is just so remarkable and over the top of what I'd been exposed to already. So here we are on a podcast with Joel Simmons talking about silicon. And so I am very excited about where this is going to take us, both as a colleague, but mostly where it's going to take us in the industry once people really start to embrace and understand the benefits of silicon and what they're going to see on their turf. I'm so excited.
So your product, talk a little bit about what the main product is that Silicon Turf manufactures.
So currently I have a granular product, Silical SS, greens grade and fairway grade. And that product is derived from basically a process that they were mining out hard rock phosphate in Tennessee, and very similar to how they manufacture steel. But because steel comes from coal and it's a very dirty element, a lot of baggage came along with that. So Tennessee hard rock phosphate is relatively pure. So when they put that in the furnace and throw in the sand and limestone, which is just a process when you're doing any sort of arc manufacturing, what ends up happening is that phosphate gets drawn off. Pretty much you're left with then purely reacted calcium silicate. So we have a very pure source that we start the product with. Then we basically pulverize it down to something similar to a talc, and then pelletize it in greens grade and fairway grade. And what that does is provides a sustainable source of monosilicic acid in the soil. So when that reacts in the soil now, because it's a granular product and it's reacting in the soil, we can sustain that monosilicic acid level so that the plant can continue to take that up.
So this is all coming out of the Tennessee brown rock.
Correct.
Which, we buy a lot of. It's
do
in a
know.
lot of our products. So that just shows how close we've always been over all these years.
Oh,
My
we
first
circulate
memory
together.
of what you were doing with this product was when, and I don't know if you actually make this claim or not, but
Making me nervous.
you broke Phil Mickelson's wrist at the Open.
Well,
That's
we
one of my.
sprained it.
Oh, he just sprained it. Okay, so had been this was what, Oakmont, and
Yeah.
and the
And to
rough
be
was.
clear, I didn't hit him with a bag of
No,
product. Or
I was
anything.
about
be
to
clear,
qualify that. Yeah, just so
Um,
people don't think that you're evil in any way, because you're not. But the turf stand was so strong and so turgid that, and then in the Open is typical, but this particular Open, and that's my first memory of this whole. She's doing what? She broke his wrist. What is she doing here? But it was the rough was so obviously so thick, as typical of the U.S. Open, and then they had applied your product, and it was super thick, and nobody could get out of it. And Phil breaks his
basically
wrist.
held on to his club. So,
Yeah.
And then they forced John to mow it for that reason. But yeah, it
So,
was impressive.
So introduce for us, I'll let you do this introduction, introduce Wendy to us and explain this partnership that you guys are building, and most importantly, the branding that's going to come with this partnership, which I love.
Well, as I shared, I I had heard all of these murmurings about this Wendy Zellner, and I, read her bio online and the things that she was working with. But really, when I met her in Cincinnati, it was just the way that Wendy understands silicon, and the research that she's done has just really uncovered so many things that I always knew were there, but we hadn't really been able to find the research to communicate it well. And I love academia. We all love academia. It's important, but Wendy just has such a gift for being able to communicate what she knows and what she has learned about silicon in a way that makes it exciting and engaging. And that was my first experience in Cincinnati. And I'm like, I can't, I have been literally bugging her and calling her and texting her nonstop since December, because
she's like that, Wendy. It's okay.
Well, and I, to be fair, I haven't had anyone get as excited about just the things that are happening with silicon until I met Wendy. So she is my silicon sister. And we will be putting together some little Twitter type information as the Silicon Sisters to help all of you learn about what a cool nutrient silicon is. And
a great brand. I mean, the Silicon Sisters is just so cool. Like I said earlier, we gotta write out a song and play it out, see what happens. Wendy, did you guys met at Acres USA?
Correct.
At the national conference. Did you speak at that?
I did not. I was just there as a guest. It was my first time at Acres.
Oh, really?
Yep. So it was my first experience with that group, and it was a lot of fun, but I was just there to observe and meet a lot of new people that I hadn't met yet.
Just so I can qualify this and explain Acres to people that may not be familiar with it, Acres USA is really the voice of sustainable agriculture. We've been very, very close with Acres. Bill McKibben's book, Jerry Brunetti's book are both published by Acres. Acres is as much a publishing house as anything. So their library is extensive. And I encourage anybody that's listening to go to acresusa.com, and you can go into their bookstore, and some of the publications that they have are just phenomenal, and they do wonderful stuff. And it's a very soils oriented thing. As folks that have listened to our podcast know, we're a big supporter of Dr. William Albrecht, and Dr. Albrecht is really one of the founders, one of the big voices at Acres USA. So Wendy, let's get into this. And I think a lot of people are really kind of confused as to silica, silicon, silicic acid. I mean, I don't even know how to start with that, but one of the things that you said, Sheree, which is always interesting to me, is that it's not even recognized as an element, which of course I think we would all agree is just one of the most absurd things in the world. And Wendy, and I shared this story with you before we got going, but when I got prepared for this meeting, I did what I always do, and I call our chemist and friend Lawrence Mayhew, and I said I was going to be talking to somebody about silicon. He goes, Wendy Zellner? And I'm like, yes, as a matter of fact. Do you know her? I've seen her speak. She's unbelievable. She's really very good. And then he went on to this whole thing about what is silicon, what's in there. And I was just blown away by the fact that there's so much about this that nobody really even knows about. So I don't know how we start this, but start us off by explaining to our audience and us and me, what the hell is silicon?
Yep, that's all right. So when I started researching silicon, it was back in 2005. I was a graduate student at the University of Toledo, and we had some funding from USDA ARS, which was on campus. So that was Jonathan France and Jim Locke, and they were studying silicon in floriculture production and boron and some other nutrients. My focus was on disease, or nutrition and disease, and what effect that had. And so we started looking at boron and silicon and what effect it had on viral infection in plants. And quickly we saw that silicon just had this remarkable effect on suppressing disease and disease formation in plants that didn't take up a lot of silicon. So the literature didn't make sense with what we were seeing.
Shocking.
Yes. Oh, I know. They got it wrong. No, but as we started to dig deeper, it turned into a lot more questions than there were answers. And so everything that we were seeing in the lab was contradicting what was published in the literature, as we were focused in on more floriculture crops, and tobacco was my model system, as it only took up a small amount of silicon. But we were seeing all of the positive benefits that they were talking about in the rice and in the grass species. And so what we quickly learned, that you can't think about plant health without silicon being a component of that. And I believe even Emmanuel Epstein, who they claim to be the grandfather of silicon here in the US, he had made that claim that, you know, when we look at nutrition and health studies, a lot of these studies are artifacts because silicon's left out of the equation. And that's really what we're starting to see with that. And I think the big issue that we have with the misunderstanding and why we really can't get a handle on silicon, we've always talked about it as this weird, strange element that's kind of out in right field, probably similar to how we thought of carbon before we really looked at carbon-based fertilizers and why carbon wasn't so important for plant health
That's
and plant
heresy.
growth.
There's no such thing.
Well,
There's plenty of carbon. You
exactly.
don't need carbon.
But that's exactly what we have with silicon. It is, and you know, they're right next to each other on the periodic
Yes,
table.
they are. I was going to say that.
Yep.
I didn't. I studied that.
But we're seeing very similar kind of stories and paths with carbon and silicon. So, and I just lost my train of thought getting into the carbon.
Well, you know,
aspect,
let me stop you
okay.
real quick, because I neglected to really allow you to introduce yourself and give us your background. I know you're an adjunct professor at the University of Toledo, but how does one get into, and you have your PhD, is your PhD in silicon? I mean, how do you get into silicon? And give us a little background as to who you are and how you got into all this.
Well, interesting enough, my background, I grew up in a small town. I did not have any agriculture background whatsoever until I got into high school, got active with the FFA program, really got into the leadership aspects, and knew I wanted to do something plant-based. I love science, I love mathematics, genetics, absolutely love. So I went to the Ohio State University to start out in a plant biology degree. But I loved every aspect of cell physiology. And so I finished a biology degree at the University of Toledo, where they're more focused on animal and medical based things. So my background is in cellular and molecular biology.
Wow.
I've taught human physiology, cell biology, and I currently teach the clinical microbiology course at the University of Toledo. And so it's not just plant-based, but I am interested in how cells interact, how nutrients are used for cell health, disease, all of that kind of stuff. And so really the silicon part came during my graduate studies when we started working with Jonathan France of the USDA. And again, just seeing what they were seeing and seeing that there's a lot more to the story than silicon use in rice and sugarcane. That was really all that was published at that time. And the problem is I was bitten by the silicon bug. Once you get into this field and see how amazing silicon is, and the fact that it isn't recognized as a nutrient, that has been my driving force since my graduate work. Is I want to see this raised to the level of a plant nutrient and recognized here in the United States. Countries like Japan and Brazil, they do recognize silicon as an essential nutrient for plant health. Here in the United States, we do see it as essential for animal health. So animal and human health, silicon is a known nutrient, but it's neglected when we come to plants.
And is that just because it's not one of the 16 essential elements?
The problem is because you can't, a plant still completes its life cycle without silicon present, but that's in quotation marks.
Right.
I recently published a paper where we looked at 10 different tomato varieties. We grew them in a hydroponic system, which was purified, ultra purified water, lab grade chemicals. So we didn't introduce any silicon into the system that we could detect. However, when we ran tissue analysis on the root and the leaves, we still saw anywhere from 20 to 100 parts per million of silicon in the plant tissue.
Shocking.
So yeah, it's coming from somewhere. And plants are really great. So even though we can't really grow plants in the absence of silicon to either support or refute it as an essential nutrient. But
let me go all the way back to the very beginning, just because,
Yep.
And I'm using me as example because I'm half a moron when it comes to some of these things. But let's define what we're talking about. I mean, silicone is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's the most abundant mineral on the face of the earth. So what are we really talking about? And that's quartz and sand. I mean, we're not talking about quartz and sand, but when we're talking physiologically, what are we really talking about? And define, I mean, we're not talking orthosilic acid. We're not talking silicone. Help us all better understand what the heck are we really talking about when we're talking about plant material?
Yep. And it's really easy. So when we think about silicon, the problem is, again, I was talking about how we had it as this oddball element. When you start thinking of it in the context of a nutrient, it makes sense. So if we think about rock phosphate is very different than phosphate that we use to fertilize plants. So the availability changes, right? And it's the same with any nutrient. We have nutrients that are unavailable for absorption, and then we have them that are broken down and weathered to where we can use them. So when we think of silicon is actually the second most abundant element in our soil and crust, and it's only because it has a higher number, because with every silicon you have at least 3 to 4 oxygens. So oxygen does beat silicon out.
Oxygen is number one and silicon is number 2.
Correct.
Well,
but
that's funny because I use that. I asked the question when I teach class, and I just did this in Florida yesterday. I say, what's the most important nutrient turf? And they all go around and they say nitrogen and calcium, and they suck up to me and say carbon, but it's actually oxygen. And I get to give away a little Yeti, but that's nice to have that confirmed so that I'm not completely off base. So what you're talking about is the mineralization of silica. And is the word silicon the right term that we should be using, or silica, or help us again better understand how to define this, or at least reference it?
So silicon is the element. Silica is when it is bounded to oxygen. So when we see it in glass or sand or quartz or even opal and phytoliths as it's deposited in some plant tissue, that's where the silica comes from. And then we have silicates, which are when we have cations, so calcium, sodium, or potassium that interact with the silicon or the silicic acid molecules that help kind of keep it in a more amorphous or a more soluble state. And then go ahead.
No, you're on a roll. I like it.
Okay.
And I don't want to interrupt.
Nope, you're okay. The other one that is often said is silicone, which we use in the building industry and as a sealant and other things. That actually is a manufactured product that has an R group attached to the silicon molecule. So it's a little bit different. And then we have silicic acid. So silicic acid is actually the soluble form of silicon that we know is absorbed and transported in plants and in animal systems. So that silicic acid is what we view as the plant available form of silicon. But that silicic acid can be broken down from silicates. It can be broken down from silicone, which is really interesting. And
really?
It can be, yes, glass can release silicic acid. So any silicon containing material can release this basic subunit of the silicon molecule, which is absorbed by the different microbes, plants, and animals in the system. And that is,
go ahead. talk to me about the physiology of what. Let's get into the plant specifically, and I want to come back to that because I'm writing all these notes, and they're way more than the notes that I had when I was talking to Lawrence. But talk to me. Let's start with the plant real quick, and then come back to this conversation so we can kind of see the whole cycle. What's the importance of, and I'm going to refer to silicon, excuse me. See, I'm not going to even get it right.
It's okay.
I'm going to get silicon. What does the plant do with silicon?
Well, the great thing is we don't really know exactly. And that is one of the issues that we have. And when I say we don't know what the plant does with silicon, we don't know specifically what it does, but we do know the effects. So I will speak to the effects of silicon. It isn't directly, but we know when we start giving plants silicon, if they're deprived of them, that we get a lot better water relations. Water relations is one of the main key that give us all of the responses that we're seeing. So you have better drought tolerance, you have more resilience of those plants when it comes to adverse environmental conditions. So too much heat, too much cold. By having that balanced water, it helps them balance their temperature and get through those conditions better. So
it allows them to tolerate drought conditions better?
Yes. Yep.
So in climates of the world where water is obviously becoming the biggest battlefront of all, silicon becomes a major player in that conversation. That's fantastic.
Correct. And you can think of it just like us. So when we get hot and we start to sweat, we lose a lot of water. So being able to retain that water in the root system and in the tissue of the plant, that's one of the benefits that silicon, we don't really understand that mechanism yet, but we do know that it plays a role in water relationships in the plant. And that also helps with nutrient balance within a plant. So the silicon helps with nitrogen use efficiency and phosphate use efficiency, which means that we can fertilize at a lower rate and still have similar yields when silicon's part of that equation. And what's really interesting with the silicon and phosphate, when you don't have silicon in a system, plants will start scavenging all of these nutrients trying to get that silicon that they need. And so what tends to happen is they'll take up additional phosphate or nitrogen, which throws off that balance. And when you have too much phosphate in the plant, it can throw off the metals concentration, so you don't get as much zinc or nickel uptake, which affects your enzyme reactions. And so
the plant would actually go after phosphorus or nitrogen in an attempt to try to find silicon?
And it's not going after that. They're getting taken up through the similar transporters because silicon, the plant is trying to take up silicon. So It's like you going through your house when you're hungry for chocolate and you don't have any chocolate, but you eat everything else sugar-based and you don't get that chocolate.
You've been watching that?
He communicates it in ways that apply to all of us. I need a potato chip or something, but I don't.
I really wanted chocolate, but I'm eating potato chip.
Right. And, and that throws off your sugar balance. It throws everything off. Then if you just had that chocolate to satisfy that craving, and you would be good. And so that's what we're seeing with silicon is when we start putting it back into the system, and you have to realize we've been pulling silicon out for centuries from these cropping systems, from these lawns, without putting it back in. And so we're
demineralizing.
Yes, completely. And it is one of the biggest issues we're going to be facing here in the United States. They already are aware of it in Europe because they have older soils and they've already been putting it back in, similar to in Brazil and in your highly weathered soils. They understand the importance of it because they've already used up those silicic acid pools or those dissolved silicon pools. And that's what we're starting to see here in the US and specifically in a lot of these different cultivation systems.
Let me play devil's advocate, and I think you just answered the question, but it's the second biggest element on the crust of the earth. Why do we care?
Because it's not in the available form. And it's that dissolved, it's the silicic acid that we're interested in. And so the one thing is the solubility of silicon is rather low. It's only about 30 to 60 parts per million, which is 1 to 2 millimolar. But if you look at soil solutions, that concentration, is a lot less because you have a lot of organisms and cells that are competing for that silicon resource. And so when we look at plants, specifically in turf, they take up as much silicon as they do nitrogen and close to the amount of carbon, if not equal to carbon, depending on the turf that we're looking at.
Really?
So as we continually deplete those silicon pools in these systems, you're not able to give the plants what they need. Specifically with turf, they need it for strength, and then they also need it for defense and health responses.
Right, to give it some level of protection in this.
Correct.
How do you do the research? And I'm going to keep circling around here, but how do you actually do that level of research? I mean, not to get into a real heavy laboratory dissertation, but give me a quick understanding. I mean, how do you even evaluate that? You know, you're throwing a lot of data at us, but how does that come to you?
So a lot of the research that I do, specifically right now, I'm looking for what I'm referring to as silica cells, understanding where the silicon is going in the cell. And so we can use tissue analysis to look at silicon concentration in different plants, which I have done with my postdoc with the USDA ARS, and then continuing on. But you can also use scanning electron microscopy to look at epidermal cells, which I've been doing a lot, and look to see where the different elements are localized on the surface of the cells that you're looking at. That's how I do the research. We can also look, a lot of researchers are looking at different cell structures that are fortified with silicon and doing more of a staining and histological type of looking, but the majority of the research that's out there is more on the applied, where they put it out and then they look for responses, or they look at enzymatic activity with that. So a lot of it is applied. The thing is, we know it works. We know it works really well. We know it works against all of these stress. It's the how and why that we don't know. So it's more getting into the molecular stuff that we really need to focus on the research side. But from a consumer and a user standpoint, silicon is essential for all plant health. And it's really, really important for the turf grass industry.
So you really are a silicone sister, aren't you?
Yeah.
We found her.
Yeah. Sheree, talk to me about a little bit about, I mean, you've been playing with this for a long time and you've been working with golf course superintendents with this. What do they see when they put down your product? I mean, what's the visual that they're experiencing when they're using silicone products?
Well, one of the things I do want to emphasize, because it's easy to fall into that trap of, oh, I'm going to put it out and what am I going to see? Well, it's not a nitrogen. We're not putting out iron. We're not putting out something that you're going to see an immediate response. But the way that Wendy and I want an applicator to think about it is, you're building resilience in this plant. So we want to make the applications when we know that the plant's moving into those most stressful phases. So in most of the country, that's, that whole Memorial Day to Labor Day, maybe with climate change extending a little past that.
Yeah.
But what guys will tell me is, places that either they were having to go out and syringe, in the heat of the day, or they were really babying along, all of a sudden they're not seeing that wilt. They're not seeing that immediate shutdown of the plant because of heat. And if they know, a lot of guys will anticipate, if they know they're getting a weather event, they're going to not see rain for a week and have temperatures above 80. They'll go out and make an application, a small application of Silico, and eliminate all of that response later. Then the other piece of it is moving into that winter. A lot of guys, especially in the far Northeast, will make an application right before they shut down irrigation, because to Wendy's point, part of that moderating and regulating water in the plant, we don't get that same desiccation of tissue because that's a result of dehydration.
Right.
The cold temperatures, the moisture in the plant, reduce the moisture in the plant. Now you have a dehydrated plant that then that tissue doesn't survive through that winter.
I think I think a lot of it, I mean, I certainly was, and I'll be the first to say that I'm relatively naive, but I think a lot of folks think of these types of products as just products that create turgidity in the plant. But what you're telling me, Wendy and Sheree, is that this is really a water and stress management tool element that's really bringing some significant physiological advantages to the plant material. Is it, I mean, Wendy, I know you haven't done a ton of work with turf. You're doing more work with other crops. Is it similar in animals as well, or human health?
So, and that's what's interesting. As we're talking a lot about water relations, it's not just water relations. That is just one of the big components that can explain a lot of the responses we're seeing. It also helps at the inflammation level. And so we know in animals and in humans, silicon can reduce inflammation. So, beer is a great source of silicon.
Really?
Although,
Oh,
yes,
thank
beer
goodness.
and wine has quite
Even
a high
better.
amount. Yes, yep. So if you have your daily beer, you're helping reduce inflammation.
I'll tell my doctor that
yeah.
on Monday when I go for my
There
physical.
you go. It's also important for bone formation in animals.
You would think
For
so. Yeah,
yep,
that makes sense.
cartilage
Yeah.
formation and collagen. So as we age, we actually, that's why we get wrinkles, because we don't absorb silicon as well, and it doesn't move to the cells that help fill in the collagen.
So we should drink more wine and not
Yes.
wrinkle
Yep.
up? I like that. All right, good.
It's also tied to neurological function somehow. So we know that those suffering from Alzheimer's disease and some other issues, it's likely because of the lack of silicon in the brain. It does have the ability to move through the brain-blood barrier. So it's actually playing a role at a lot of different cellular and molecular levels in humans and in plants that we really can't put our finger on yet.
Is silicon getting a lot of attention in the medical communities?
It's actually seems here in the US to it's getting into animal feeds more. And so it's really starting to take off in that market. They are talking about silicon a lot as a supplement, not so much with the medical community. But I do see that there's a researcher in the UK who has done a lot of work at looking at aging and silicon. And so as his research continues on, I do see that this is going to get more into the animal and human side on the health issues.
Yeah.
But when you think about it at the cellular level, there are a lot of overlapping processes between plants and animal cells. And so these same mechanisms are true. The transporters they've identified in humans are similar to those transporters that have been identified in plants. And they were first identified in plants, which usually that's the case, is we understand the process in a plant system, and then we find it to be present in a human or animal system.
Is academia internationally focusing more and more on this element?
I wouldn't say more and more. There are definitely some really strong silicon researchers throughout the world that have been doing some amazing jobs, especially when it comes to looking at the formation of the water barriers in the root system. And so there is a portion of researchers, but it's still not in the mainstream. So mainstream scientists still do not see the benefits of the silicon. And it's really because we are limited with the technology that we have to study it in a research-based lab. And so that kind of makes researchers leery of what our findings are. And it's really, as the technology gets better, we should get more people on board.
And don't take any offense to this question, but where's the research funding coming from?
Private companies. Here in the US, the majority of the research is privately funded through either distributors or manufacturers for that. It's very hard to get research dollars for silicon because they don't see the value in that.
But these are companies that have seen the value and are trying to explore it further and qualify and quantify it, which is good. which
Yep.
is how most of this kind of starts. Talk to me about how it works in the soil. I mean, you broached this and I kind of spun you backwards, but let's get back into, we're putting down silicon. How's it actually getting into the plant? I mean, for the most part, and again, redirect me if I'm going down the wrong road. We're talking about remineralizing the soil, which is obviously not plant available. That's now being reacted by rise of deposits from plant material. It's being reacted by microbial activity. Am I on the right track? Is this how these minerals are being released and then brought into the plant?
Correct. So when we think about the parent material in the soil, there are specific microbes that we know can break down different forms of silicon. There are some that are great at breaking down quartz. And so that's your highly crystalline that usually takes a really long time to break down naturally, but they can increase that weathering process. A lot of the fertilizers, though, that we're putting into these soil systems are also water soluble. So as the water, the soil solution will help solubilize those products as well. And microbial action is also possible for getting that down to, again, that silicic acid or that dissolved silicon pool that the plants can then draw from. And so then when it's in that solution, it can be, it is absorbed through the root hairs of the plants through specialized transporters. And that's how it's mobilized into the plants. And then they can move it either down into the growing roots or up into the shoots or the blades.
So there's identified microbes that are specific to being able to eat that rock. And I think I have somewhere, I used to have a piece of quartz on my desk as a, as an element, it's just something to give me energy here, but, and it's hard. It's incredibly hard. I mean, it just amazes me that there's microbes specific. So we can identify those and isolate them and perhaps even encourage them or even bring them to the table.
Exactly. I did dabble a little bit on trying to generate specific microbes that would solubilize some of these products a little more rapidly. And so it is a possibility. I'm going to give that away because I'll probably never pick that project back up. But Bacillus species and Azotobacter seem to be the two that have the ability to weather these silicate minerals. And if you know,
species.
Bacillus,
Oh,
which
bacillus.
we use,
I'm sorry.
Bacillus.
Okay, bacillus species.
Which we use bacillus a lot as microbial inoculants. And it's interesting to me as they talk about all of these beneficial effects of putting bacillus into the system, what effect that has on the silicon mineralization in those soils, in addition to the other aspects that they're providing to the plants.
We actually inoculate, we have a product called BioVantage, which is bacillus species. So can I now go tell everybody I'm a silicon sister and I'm out there helping?
You're a boy.
Oh,
you have to grow your hair out.
I hate when
that happens. You can be a
happens.
silicon brother.
Okay.
You can be a Silibro.
Silibro, I like that. I'd like to have that on my shirt, Silibro. But that kind of a product, and there's a number of products. I'm not trying to be a commercial here, but bacillus inoculants are fairly common in the turf industry and in the ag industry. Those inoculants are helping to dissolve some of the silica.
I did not say that specifically. We haven't explored it. We haven't explored it. However, if you're looking to explore that, I can do the testing for you.
I knew this would end up being a commercial.
Sorry.
All right.
But no, we can't, it's definitely plausible. And that's the most important thing is there are so many aspects of silicon that we haven't really even dove into. That are likely playing a role behind the scenes, adding to, again, not a direct effect, but helping add to all of these benefits that we're seeing of putting these natural components back into the growing systems.
Let's talk about some of the products, not necessarily by name, but we broached this earlier. Even here at EarthWorks, we've tried many times to create a liquid product and it's bloody difficult. I mean, it's and you can qualify this for me, but my understanding is that we need to maintain a pH of 8.5. I mean, help me understand what it would take to get a true liquid silica kind of a product. And there's a number of them out there in the industry, and I've always been a little skeptical as to really, what are they doing? But I want one.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot of different options you can go with. typically the pH is an issue because silicon loves to interact with itself. So
Right.
silicon will fold on itself, it'll gel up, and then you really have nothing that's soluble at that
And
point.
guys love gel in their spray tanks.
Yeah.
And so that's
Oh,
what
I'm sure.
yeah,
Right.
they love that. It's a lot of fun. Yeah.
Right.
We never get calls when that happens.
Oh gosh, no. But that's where having the high pH, silicon is a lot different than these other nutrients. So silicon is the solubility increases as pH increases, and usually it's as you go above a 9. So a lot of the
Oh,
liquid
really?
products, yes, are at a pH of 10, 11, or 12, which sounds really dangerous, but it's not caustic. So it doesn't really have the issues that maybe other products at those high pHs would have.
How would you maintain that in a liquid formula? A pH of
I
9.
so
Water is
I
7.
have no that's where the potassium and sodium
Hydroxide,
hydroxides
yeah.
come in to help with forming the silicates. But there's a lot of different in Europe, they have what's called stabilized silicic acids. So they can use polymers or polyethylene glycol or other sugars to keep silicon in solution at higher concentrations. Um, and those tend to be, I think, more neutral. So they don't have the high pH because they're using the polymers in place of the ionic salts that go in. And then there's other sources. And I apologize. I'm not a manufacturer. Again,
No, I know. That's
I'm
okay. I put
or
you
a
on the spot.
chemist. I am horrible at chemistry. I'm much more comfortable biology and physiology.
Talking about cells. We'll get
Right.
back to that.
But that's where it comes down to the manufacturing process. I know they're using rice hulls a lot as a source for the silicon because it deposits a high concentration of silicon into these. And then with that plant, and those are called phytoliths or opal and silica, the breakdown or the solubility again comes to different components that they put into that mix to keep the silicon from interacting with itself, or silicon loves all the other elements.
Yeah.
So it'll interact with everything else in your mix also if it gets to too high of a concentration. So the concentration and what's in that formulation is going to affect how available that silicon is going to be when you put it into a tank mix and then when you actually apply it to the field or to the turf grass.
Yeah, I mean, we as a manufacturer, and I've had long conversations with Lawrence about this. We're not sure how we can maintain that, and then we're petrified if that product would be thrown into a lower pH. Would the silicon react? Let's say if we had a pH product that was stabilized in a jug, and then we put it into a tank of water, would there be reactions, or potentially be reactions?
So water alone, so I've used a lot of different products in the lab, and I don't tank mix, but I just put it into a big 5-gallon bucket when I'm
Same
using it
basic
as a
difference,
first.
yeah.
Right. So it's a huge jar test
Yeah.
in a way.
Yeah.
And with that, I have not had issues, but my nutrient solution is usually diluted, and I'm with these silicon, the liquid products at least, you're adding such a small concentration because they are so concentrated. The concentration you want to be at when you apply is 30 to 60 parts per million. So that is 0.003%.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Very
usually these products are anywhere from 2 to up to, I think 18% is the highest that I've worked with so far.
Yeah.
And so these are very, very concentrated. As we dilute those out, you don't have the silicon issues with it being in that mix. So if you first were to mix it into the water to get it down to that 30 to 60 parts per million, you should have very little compatibility issue after that point. But it's getting it to that, just like any other nutrient that has incompatibility issues. It's all in what order you apply it to that mix.
The most frightening part of what we do. And I don't want to put you on the spot with this, but there's a lot of products, certainly in the turf market.
Yep.
And they seem to make a lot of claims. And I've always been skeptical as to, is there really, is anything happening? And knowing the chemistry of this, is it fair to assume that maybe, and I'm not going to pick on anybody by name, obviously, but is it fair to assume that maybe some of these products are not providing us the level of silicon that we're really hoping to have?
Yes, and what's interesting about that is the labeling is changing here in the U.S. I came in 2019 as an industry liaison to APCO, or the American
Right.
Association of Plant Food Control
Do
Officials.
they recognize silicone?
They
APCO?
do. Yep.
Oh, they do.
So
Okay, good.
silicon is under the beneficial substance.
Oh,
So that
wow.
category was created before I became part of the group specifically for silicon, and then humic acids came in. And this is where the biostimulants are going to fall under the fertilizer regulation
Yes.
within that beneficial substance group. So I've been working closely with that group on recognizing these different biostimulants and how the efficacy, all that kind of stuff. But with that, and again, I apologize, I lost my
okay.
train of thought.
Let me ask you this. So having said of all of this,
Oh.
and I think this kind of brings back full circle to what Sheree's been doing for all these years, it sounds like the best way for us to get, you know, an adequate amount of silicon in our environment, in the turf environment, is through the mineralization of these materials. And
Right.
and Sheree, I mean, that's really what has been the core of your business since you started it back in the day. And it's all granular, and you've been working around, you know, and I don't mean this to mean self-serving, but you know, we've worked well together as company partners, and when we bring to the table carbon along with these minerals, and now we get a stimulation of microbes. I mean, and again, you can certainly correct me if I'm not going down the right direction here, but it just seems like there's a good marriage there, and the microbial activity is what's really pushing this.
And I think, and you and I have noticed that over the years
Yeah.
together. We've always speculated that there is some symbiotic thing happening between folks who are on a EarthWorks program and also on a Silico program, because they're just seeing really phenomenal results, really resilient turf.
Yeah.
And I think Wendy is now helping you and I understand exactly why that's been happening, because EarthWorks products and remineralizations and increasing microbial populations is exactly the reason why we're seeing the benefits we're seeing from Silico, because we have all of those systems working together.
Now, in your product, I assume, I mean, this is a calcium silica. Is it what is the molecular build breakdown or composition of your particular product?
It is silicon dioxide. Am I saying that correct, Wendy? The calcium silicate is a SiO4.
I think it's a calcium silicate, because when the limestone and the sand come together, you have, so it is, I would probably classify it as a calcium silicate.
Are there other elements within that molecule, or is there phosphorus left out of it from that process, or no? Is it more of a calcium molecule?
It's more of a pretty pure calcium silicate, almost identical chemically to elastonite, which is pure calcium silicate.
So in the process, you're getting available calcium and available silica in an environment. So clearly, in a healthier, biologically healthier soil, this process is going to be improved. And I assume that is also being encouraged by the plant itself. And the plant, I mean, we know that plants have the ability to go and find minerals like phosphorus or iron or whatever it is. I assume that the plant would have the same intelligence to go and say, and I think you already broached this, Wendy, that the plant is going to go out and say, you know, I need some silicon, and I'm going to go find it. Maybe I happen to get some nitrogen and phosphorus in the way, or potato chips, or whatever analogy we're going to use. But is that a fair assessment?
Yes, definitely. And especially when we think about grass species with the high accumulation, I actually consider them hyperaccumulators. So they're really going to get those root systems out in and looking for this available silicon.
So let me just kind of review a little bit. So, and this, I didn't realize this until we started talking, but one of the biggest benefits here is water management within the plant. So it's actually helping to osmotically bring water in, or help me understand the water piece of this puzzle.
So we're still trying, and I say we, this is not part of my research, but something that I would like to get into. Studies have shown using rice and onion, interestingly enough, that when you give silicon to the plant, it's not depositing silicon in the endodermal and exodermal barriers. So these are like waxy barriers in the root that help keep the water from moving out and the nutrients from moving out as the soil dries down.
Gotcha.
But it helps build these barriers, and it builds it deeper into the root system than if silicon wasn't there. So what that means is that you have a better water retention longer down through the root system when silicon's present than when it's not. How that's actually taking place, we don't really know, but it does. That's what's leading to the retention in the water as the soils dry down or as the soils start to freeze. And we're seeing in other plants, it's likely also helping maintain that water, and it might be doing that also in grass species in the leaf tissue as well, because there are certain cells that form these types of barriers all throughout the plant, not just in the root system, but that's where the studies have been so far.
Do we have any understanding as to the need from microbial populations for silicon? Are they utilizing it for their metabolism?
So I don't know if there are any specific studies on what exactly they need. It is inferred that it's important for cell division, and possibly some cellular responses. But again, our um, our ability to look at that and understand that are extremely lacking. Just because silicon is so abundant, it's really hard to design those studies to have a silicon-free or a silicon-reduced system that we can actually understand what's going on.
So, but the assumption, I mean, the common assumption is that there is some interaction or there's some utilization, if you will, of microbial populations. How were you able to identify the specific microbes that are, really the ones you were mentioning earlier that were, really involved in breaking down silicone?
That was, and I forget now what study did that because I looked at that back in probably 2015. So the
it's in the
study came out
literature.
prior to it. Yes, that is in the literature. And they were looking at just the biomineralization of different nutrients. So it wasn't just silicon. I think calcium might have been part of that. So they were looking at breaking down of bone in the soils and stuff like that as well. And silicon, that's you can do now deep sequencing, so RNA-seq, where I think it's so cheap that almost anyone can get a pocket mini ion and go out to their soils and see what is present within there. But there are techniques that we can use that are readily available when it comes to looking at the microbes and then understanding how they break down different minerals or different formulations of silicon.
Are you as interested in working with microbes as you are cells?
Yes. Yeah.
Oh, good.
Microbes are cells. So
they are cells.
Yes.
Thank you.
So yes.
It fascinates me, and I hate to say this, and you're not going to be surprised, but we're pushing up against our hour. But it fascinates me that two things that the general academia world doesn't accept silica as a nutrient, especially knowing what we know about it and what we've always known about it. But it also fascinates me that AFCO has approved it. I mean, and that I assume that's relatively recent, right?
Yes. So I should probably know the years on when it was recognized.
Relatively recent.
Yeah, within like 2012 or 2015-ish. Yep.
And I know, we talk a lot about humic substances. They've only just recently been allowed. And, we work closely with the HPTA, which helped initiate that whole movement within academia and within AFCO so that we can recognize these. But talk to me a little bit as we kind of wrap up here as to what Zellner's Research Solutions is going to be doing over the next 5 and 10 years, other than branding cool names like silicone.
Writing parodies and coming up with really
funky
marketing things. Yeah,
I like that.
So what, again, my focus as it has been is to continue with the education, continue with making silicon known for what it's doing, not necessarily what it's not doing, or, people have a really high expectations for silicon, but it is a very important part of a balanced nutrient system. So I am interested in looking at this different cellular formation um, in crops like trees, so orchards and vineyards. But then when it comes to turf, I am shocked at how little we have in the literature on what it's actually doing in the turf with the specialized silica cells. And so we're going to do a lot of looking at different grass species, how it
Good.
accumulates and where it deposits silicon. And then also really the education is my big focus of the company. And so I want to work with local high school students or undergraduate students, because the one reason why we don't view silicon the way we do here in the US, a lot of our university physiology and plant physiology professors were around in the 70s and 80s when they were doing silicon research, and they were using sand and not seeing an effect.
Shocking.
And so, right, this is where our bias to silicon has been. And so I would love to re-educate the new generation that's coming up on the importance, especially when we talk about climate change, extreme temperature events, low snowfall, less water, all of these things.
Water,
Silicon,
just water
right,
alone. Yeah.
right. Silicon is the missing key to getting plants to have better productivity, better quality in these changing and extreme conditions. So I'm going to be doing exactly what I've been doing these last 15 years, probably for the rest of my career and into retirement.
I love your passion for this element. I mean, I don't know that I've ever had a chance to talk to anybody as passionate about one element as
Right.
Lawrence Mayhew, maybe on humic substances and humic acids, but this has been wonderful. Sheree, what's the next 5 years for Silico Turf LLC? What are you seeing happening? People are obviously starting to understand silica's value, and
Well,
Silicone Sisters are going to clearly make a big impact on that.
well, and that will be a piece. I'm hitching my wagon with Wendy because, like you, I've also not had someone to get as excited about silicon with me as Wendy is. So I'm so excited that she wants to further awareness. You know, that's been my battle, trying to get this this nutrient recognized in our industry. So, you know, I'm going to continue that. I want to build, you know, my Silico Turf's corral of products around what we're going to learn, and bringing more important soluble silicon products to the market. That's
So
my goal.
do we think that we can actually get good soluble liquid products to the market? All right, I'm in. Can I be a Silico bro if that's the
I will
case?
keep you posted on that one.
I want to
Very
be a Silico
soon.
bro.
Yeah, very soon.
Silica Sisters cooler, but Silico bro, I would accept that. I can't thank you guys. I mean, Wendy, it's been fascinating, and I think we could literally go on for hours, and maybe we'll have to do this again before too long. But I think I love the passion. I mean, I've known Sheree talking about this, but the fact that you were able to find a sister in this battle of yours has just been phenomenal. And I certainly hope that you guys can take this to the streets and help people understand. And you know, and I think we all know that this battle of, you know, these elements aren't needed by the plant. That was research done in the 30s hydroponically. There's 90 trace elements out there. Silicon is in the world at that level for a reason. So it just makes sense that you know, we've got to find, you know, a better way to, you know, incorporate it into what we're doing. And clearly turf is a great benefit of silicon. And now knowing that, you know, it goes way beyond turgidity, which is what I think most people in our industry thinks of, is that it just stands the grass up so they can roll a little bit better. It's so much more than that. So I wish the Silicone Sisters the greatest of luck, and I certainly will do my best to promote, and I want to I want a Silico bro shirt someday. Thank you both
Thank you.
very much. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
And that is the EarthWorks podcast. We will be back next week for 102. We're going to start counting now that we're into this. But if you're not a subscriber to the EarthWorks podcast, please be, because you get to learn some fascinating things like we just did here. And my head is now, I got to go rest. I got to go lie down because this has been too much. Thank you so much for
Thank
joining
you.
us.